Welcome to HortTube. My name is John Putnam. This is the garden question and answer video that I do pretty much every Sunday. You can ask questions down in the comment section below the video, and that's where I pick from each week. I think there's like 24 questions or something we've written for this week. So again, thank you guys very much for participating in the video, because without your questions, there is no subscriber question and answer video. The Learn to Garden video series and the weekly garden planner are both $50 off for the entire month of December. You can give them as a gift by purchasing them with your email address and password, and then you can transfer over the email address to the person you're giving it to later for their email address. And then if they need to change the password at that point, they can change the password. But that's the way that that can go if you want to give those as a gift. If you're interested in t-shirts, the t-shirts are 10% off, and the codes are up here on the screen that you can use over on my website to get the 10% off. Steph does the shipping on the t-shirts, so if you're interested in t-shirts and you want to get them by Christmas, sometime in here would be the time to do that. And thank you guys so much for considering that. Let's see, I've got to get bulbs in the ground this week. It's 22 degrees out here this morning. Last week shot, it was 26 degrees and I was in shorts and a jacket or whatever, or pullover. So it's 22 this morning as I'm shooting this, and I have now, I have long pants and a coat. So it's between 26 and 22 where I upgrade the clothing. But I do get neighbors, I'll be walking the dogs and it'll be 40 and I'm in shorts, and I get people to stop and roll down the windows and go, why aren't you cold? I don't know. I've just always been able to wear shorts, and just as long as I'm warm, my chest is warm, it just doesn't bother me at all, really. But 22 degrees, it does bother me. Where was I on this? Got to get some bulbs in the ground this week. Put up a video yesterday as you're watching this on amaryllis, and what else? There's a garden cleanup video that I have not completed yet because the garden, it needs a little bit more cleanup. These temperatures have dropped really quickly, and it's not like 22 degrees is damaging to most of these plants out here, but when it hasn't been cold at all before it happens, there's probably going to be a little bit of damage out here, I would think, on a few evergreen things that were unprepared for this cold. So it'll be interesting going through the winter and into next spring to see what is or isn't damaged out here, as I am pushing the boundaries on quite a few things out here. And again, 22 is not the temperature that would have hurt them if we'd have gone slowly down to 22, but we just didn't. We had nights in the 50s and then all of a sudden 22 and high of 39 one day the other day. But anyway, it'll be interesting. I can't remember what else went up this week. A few single plant videos, and there you go. All right, so let's get into some questions from this past week. And again, I think there's about 24, so we'll jump in here and get to going. When you are bringing in plants because of cold temperatures, what is the best space? Cool room, an unheated garage, is a sunny window too warm? Depends on the plants you're bringing in. Obviously, if you're bringing in tropicals, those need to just stay inside through the winter time in all likelihood, unless you're in Florida and you're just getting a couple temporary nights where it's going to be cold, and you can bring those, potentially bring those tropical plants back out. But for most of us, once the tropical plants go in, they need to be in. And a bright sunny window is probably the equivalent of a shady space outside. So, the things that you leave out in part shaded spaces, your tropicals in the summer outside, they're going to need bright light indoors. Your shrubs or perennials or things that you may have bought on sale and you haven't planted yet, or things you leave in a container but you're nervous about them, the garage should be fine unless the pots freeze solid in there. So you may want to put a thermometer in there on this 22 degree night. Does your garage drop below freezing? Most probably don't, but it's possible that they do. So you just want to keep the pot from freezing solid. That's usually the issue, is less about the top of the plant and more about the roots actually freezing solid. Because most of the time the plant will be in the ground and the roots wouldn't be frozen solid on it. But in a container, the pot freezes solid, the roots are going to be frozen solid, and they're not going to be able to get water up and down. So, and the other thing is deciduous versus evergreen plants will make a difference too. Like things that of course, I'm not next to a single deciduous plant other than a few herbaceous perennials, but these evergreen plants, most of them are more cold sensitive in a container. And there's another question about container cold coming up. But most of them are more sensitive to being frozen solid, where the deciduous plants, the plants that lose their leaves in the wintertime, they're not really using the water, so they're capable of staying more frozen, frozen for longer without it being an issue. Let's see. So a garage, if it doesn't drop completely below freezing, is probably ideal for most of those perennial shrubs, trees, those kinds of things. Tropicals need to be inside. Let's see, Florida 9B, upcoming temps in the 30s. So moving some plants inside. Is it best to leave plants dry while inside? Yeah, definitely toward the dry side. You won't want to be dry. Just, the main thing here is just to water when things need water. I mean, that's the, sometimes we get too far into the trenches about what something needs or doesn't need water-wise, but really we just need to water them when they're dry and then let them dry out. So once you bring them in the house, sometimes they'll dry out slower because they're getting less light, they're using less of the water. Sometimes they'll dry out faster because you're running the heat a lot in the house, and if it's dry heat in the house, it can dry them out a little faster. So it's just going to have to be monitored by you to figure out the pattern, and then every plant's going to be different. So you're going to have one plant that just absolutely drives you nuts because it needs to be watered 3 times a week, and then another plant that doesn't need to be watered probably the entire winter, except for maybe once. We'll bring our aloes in when it's this cold. They may need one watering the entire winter to keep them in good shape. If I water them on the same schedule that I water other things, I'm going to kill those aloes almost 100% chance that I'm going to drown them over the course of the winter. So it's a plant-to-plant situation, and you do want, in general, no matter whether it's something in the ground, in a container, inside your house, wherever, let it become slightly dry and then water them well, and then let them become slightly dry again. And that can take a long time for some plants and a short time for others. So, and it depends on the soil mix you've used, and even what the container is made out of, can have some impact on that. So it's a plant-to-plant kind of thing. And then they said, while outside, are containers best protected from cold when wet, dry, or just regular H2O? So I've always said, and everybody has always said, that water's an insulator, and to make sure that we go into really cold weather by having our containers wet or watered well. But I guess there's some research as well that says that keeping them slightly on the drier side is actually beneficial. So I don't know the answer to this 100%, but I'm one of those people that's guilty of having heard at some point that water's an insulator and, it's best to water. But I know there is some research that says slightly drier may be better for the plant than really wet. So again, same rule. If something is dry, water it. If something is, seems moist enough, just leave it be. And that way we just don't have to really think about these things, quite as much. Water it when it needs water. Okay. Somebody said how to take cuttings on basil for new plants. Depends on the type of basil. I mean, most of there are annual and perennial basils. So my African basil does not set seed, it's a hybrid, and it needs to be done from cuttings. Mine's already been fried by the 22 degrees, so we'll be buying another one next year. But I could have taken cuttings easily. They'll root easily on it. You could probably root them, under any sort of rooting, any kind of tray. I've got a lot of propagation videos on the channel, but you could probably root them under a light in the house pretty easily. A lot of the other basils, you could just collect the seed on them. So a lot of them set viable seed, and they're so easy to do from seed that I would probably skip doing a cutting on it. So it probably would be, what type of basil are we talking about? But they root readily, and the ones that do set viable seed, the seed's easy to collect and it comes up readily. So either way, it's pretty easy to keep your basil from year to year if you want to do that. But again, if it's one you did from seed, I would just get the seed. The seed is so easy. That's the way I would probably do it. Would we ever add a small greenhouse, especially to tuck in tender plants? I was in the process of building the greenhouse back in this corner. It was a metal shed. I took the skin off of it and had a shade protection piece on the top of it and was doing some propagation over there. And then I got to the point where I realized I just don't need it. I can use between the screen porch back here and the kitchen floor inside. I've got a place for the things that I need to tuck tender plants on these really, really cold nights, or these nights where it just comes out of the blue and goes, you know, super, super cold. So I just put plants in that corner late in the season. And so if you've been following the channel, that's now a planted space, but it was going to be a small greenhouse, and I just decided I didn't need it. So yes, I would consider it. You know, I think they're fun projects. I've got a couple versions of them on the channel over the years, if you want to look at those. And the first video that ever went on this channel was my old propagation house at my nursery, my big greenhouse for propagation at the old nursery. The very first video that ever went on this channel. We are only to number 5, so let's get moving. Previous owner had 1/3 of an acre of Bermuda in North Georgia with 2 annoying circular planting beds. Wants to remove the Bermuda between them to form one large bed. I get a lot of this when I'm doing consultations, where there'll be, you know, 5 little beds or 3 little beds in a front garden, and both the trees and everything you're planting out there would be, and even the grass would prefer for you to put all of those beds together and allow the trees and shrubs to have their space and the turf to have its space, for sure, rather than all the circles around things. When is the best time and how is the best way to remove this Bermuda grass? It's really best done when the Bermuda grass is actively growing, and it's best sprayed with some sort of Roundup or whatever. I mean, glyphosate is the best way to kill it. It just is. I mean, you could get a sod cutter and cut it up and flip it over. You could cover it in plastic. You could bury it in wood chips. You probably will not kill that Bermuda grass without a pesticide. I mean, without an herbicide. So that's really the best time to do it. Now, unfortunately, at this point, it's probably pretty dormant and would not respond well. And if you went out there like right now, you could attempt to bury it in 8 inches, 9 inches, 10 inches of wood chips, and that would probably rot a lot of it over the course of the winter. It's going to have a weird barrier down at the bottom of it when you start digging in the future. You know, it'll have this weird, that dead grass layer will still be down there, especially if it was originally sodded. So for me, I'd let it wake up in the spring, and then I'd kill it with an herbicide, and then I would, at that point, mend it with, you could do the wood chip method like I do, or you can just you could till it, you know, after you've sprayed it and it's died back, if you wanted to initially, and then add some compost to it. All kinds of different ways once you get to the starting line, but you're not going to get to the starting line unless you spray that Bermuda. That's, you know, you don't talk about spraying on this channel at all, but that's the one, you know, I did make a video called, "Is This the Worst Weed?" You know, and it was about Bermuda grass and how difficult it is to garden with overall. So I think that if there's anything on your spraying list, it's that, because it's hard to get to the starting line otherwise, right? I mean, you can't get it out with a sod cutter. Like fescue, you could do with a sod cutter. You could just cut it and then flip the sod upside down, and you'd kill 99% of the fescue, or bluegrass. But it won't work with Bermuda grass or centipede or zoysia, Bermuda being the worst of those, for sure. So just spray it, get to the starting line, and get yourself going next mid to late spring. How to overwinter Wells tongue agave as a young plant with 3 months in the ground. I don't really do anything to our Wells tongue agave because we planted it properly in the first place. We planted it with some expanded shells, so it drains well. So no matter how much rain I get out there on that Wells tongue agave, it's not going to hurt it, you know, because the water is going to drain away from it. So if you I don't know where, I don't have a zone for this, so I don't know what zone they're in, but it's plenty cold hardy. I mean, most of these plants from the Southwest United States or any desert areas, you know, a lot of these plants come from, they get cold. So it's typically not cold that kills them. It's bringing them to our flat Piedmont area in the clay-based soils, or wherever you have clay soils, and planting them, and then winter wet is the problem. So as long as you planted it properly, I don't think you'll need to do any additional protection to it. you know, that has exceptions. I mean, if it's going to be below like 10 degrees, you might throw something over top of it if you're nervous about it being that new in the ground. So somebody has Helene damage, 2 fallen trees, several others being removed. They're poplars and sweet gums that already sucker. If they don't get the stumps out, will they continue to sucker? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you've got, especially if you already know this about a tree that you have, that it already suckers, when it comes down like that, it's definitely going to sucker quite a bit. So getting those stumps ground out is probably ideal. You know, it's unfortunate money to be spent, and I know it's, you know, eventually those stumps will go away on their own over some long period of time. But the other thing is, post Hurricane Fran, at my old house, I had 120 some trees come down that were 4-inch, let's say 5-inch diameter or bigger, 123, plus some smaller trees than that. And I didn't get up all the stumps. I just was a young landscaper, and I was out working for other people during the day and coming home and doing this work at night. And I left a lot of those stumps in place. Those stumps became hazardous over the course of 20 years in that house. They disappear under the ground. They break down and disappear under the ground, and the ground starts settling. Sometimes it doesn't settle. And so you don't know that there's hollow pockets under the ground, and it actually becomes dangerous. You know, it's the kind of place where you'll step and go down to your knee, basically, and, you know, hurt yourself in some way or another, potentially, out there. So I think it's always a good idea to get rid of stumps. If you can afford it, if you can do it, if you can, you know, have the means to do it. I think that they'll help anything else you're trying to do in the meantime, planting and working in the garden, and they'll also prevent them from becoming hazards, you know, big potholes, invisible potholes in your garden later. Let's see, number 8. This person, it's the same person, but they were asking about limbing up a river birch because they drop so much debris. How much can they trim, and will that have an adverse effect on the tree and the roots? No, you can absolutely limb up your river birch over time. River birches are bleeder trees. There's a group of trees that don't respond well to winter pruning. They don't heal over. And so if you cut, you know, I have a river birch at the old house. If it got any damage during the winter time, it would start in the spring pumping water up to the top of the plant so that it could leaf out. You know, it starts that process in the spring. That tree would just rain down for weeks, you know, just dripping water constantly from the top of the tree where it had damaged spaces on it. So keep in mind, winter may not be the best time to prune a river birch. They heal over much better in the late spring or in the summertime than they do in the winter time. So, you know, I would absolutely limb it up, and you can limb it up however you want to limb it up. And most of the time, river birches ultimately do have to be limbed up if they're going to be in our ornamental gardens in some way. So, and the bark, that exfoliating, it exposes that exfoliating bark too, which is one of the more attractive parts of having a river birch, but it won't do any adverse effect to it. You know, again, I just don't do that pruning on river birches in the winter time. Let's see, what breed is Holly? So Holly was outside during last week's video. I don't have her out here in the this morning, but she's a part husky and Lhasa Apso. When I got her DNA done, I have no idea how a little Lhasa Apso and a husky made a dog that's bigger than a husky. I have no idea. Than normal, she's probably 10 pounds heavier than a normal husky, so I have no idea. She has all the form and shedding of a husky, but different coloration, more the coloration of that Lhasa Apso for some reason. But she'll be 16 next month. Our gladiolas and irises in the same family. Yes, they're in the Iridaceae or the Iridaceae family, but they are both irises, or both in the iris family. Are there different considerations when planting in the dead of winter, deciduous versus evergreen? Zone 8 Clara does not prefer to overwinter in pots. Will they lose leaves if winter planted? When you plant, so just some various different thoughts on planting different types of plants in the wintertime. So, you know, deciduous versus evergreen. You know, I talked about with container plants, if you're leaving something in a container for the winter time, you know, you'll hear me sometimes say something needs to be 1 or 2 zones colder than the area that you live in. So if it's a deciduous plant, I think only one zone is probably enough. So if I'm in zone 8, I need something that's at least zone 7 hardy if it's deciduous. Deciduous plants, just plants that lose their leaves in the wintertime, tend overall to care less about the pot freezing, you know, but if it's a leafy evergreen, I probably want it 2 zones colder than my area. I've never differentiated that, but I would say that leafy evergreen things need to be 2 zones colder than your area if you're leaving them in containers. In terms of putting them in the ground, I don't think there's really any difference whatsoever, but if it's a marginal leafy evergreen, if you are putting it in the ground this time of year, you need to be prepared to protect it in some way. So a sheet to throw over it, a frost protection blanket, something at the ready, maybe even reverse planting it, like, you know, like picking it back up and putting it in the pot, keeping the pot, just in case it was going to fall to some really extreme temperature during that first winter in the ground. It would be easy to go pop it back out of the ground, but initially being prepared to cover it, and then also being prepared to actually just go, oh, whoa, 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 0 degrees is too low for that plant the first year it's in the ground, and I'm going to just put it back in a pot and put it in the garage for the night or whatever. And then whether or not to cut the root balls, you know, as you're putting them in the ground. So, you know, I always talk about if I'm doing damage to the roots, that I'll cut a little bit of the top off of the plant. When I'm fall or winter planting, I don't think it's as important. So if you're having to really get aggressive after a very root-bound plant, you're having to tear at the roots quite a bit, where normally I would probably cut a little bit of the, you know, prune that plant back just a bit to compensate for that root damage I was doing. I think it's less important in the wintertime. So if you're having to really go after the roots I don't think you have to compensate by cutting anything off the top during the winter. The plant's not really growing, so it's not going to be an issue. So maybe that answers some of your questions, but the deciduous plants are just less likely to be damaged in the wintertime because they've gone fully dormant. And, you know, that's when we'll see. I think most of the deciduous plants I have in this garden, the plants that lose their leaves in the wintertime, almost entirely, they're all probably zone 5 or at least zone 6 hardy. The leafy evergreens I have in this garden outside of boxwoods, they're up, you know, and this Mahonia is zone 6 hardy. But almost all the leafy evergreens I have out here are zone 7 or only zone 7 or 8 hardy. They're just built different. The plants that lose their leaves completely in the wintertime were built for places to, you know, really go truly dormant in the winter and take, you know, a lot of extremes. Let's see. I got, again, with exceptions to that, there's a Pieris around the corner over there too that's zone 5 hardy, maybe even zone 4 hardy. Let's see. Somebody read that Acanthus mollis is invasive, but still wants one. Have we had any issues with ours? The camera's literally sitting on my Acanthus right now. It looks not happy about the 22 degrees this morning. Yes, they can really take off and take over an area, and I've seen them contained over on NC State's campus in some, you know, concrete spaces, and they have filled up those spaces over time. I think the thing, if you know going in that a plant like that is going to be aggressive in time, it takes a long time. Acanthus was 3 years old before it bloomed, and it bloomed well this year. I think it's now at the point that it's going to start to sucker. So it's a slow process, but at some point it will start to sucker and colonize in the area that it's sitting in. You have to just ask questions about yourself. If you know a plant is going to be aggressive in the future, you have to ask, am I willing to go in there and dig these pieces out and control this plant in time? Or, you know, am I not that type of gardener that wants to be maintaining this thing in the future? Or am I not potentially not physically able to get in there because they root pretty aggressively to get them out? So it's something you have to ask about yourself. But yes, that Acanthus can eat some space in time. Let's see, what is the best time to start a topiary formation? They have a blue boulevard cypress. It's currently small. Concerned about doing it in the heat of the summer or the cold of the winter. Yeah, I mean, you know, just the best, you know, this is when you do things at the best time to kind of prune them. I would probably do this coming out of winter. you can start cutting on it at that point. If it's a very small plant, I'm not going to go take 80% of the foliage off of it to start my topiary. So I'm probably going to start slow on this and do it over time. But late winter, early spring is probably the ideal time to do it before the sun could really wreak havoc on it later. Because when you start cutting foliage out of things, when I start cutting foliage out of things, and there's foliage under this that hasn't seen the sun, whether it's a conifer, leafy evergreen, deciduous plant, whatever it is, if there's leaves on that plant that haven't seen the sun, and you start cutting on it in the peak summer, it's going to burn the remaining foliage that's left on that plant. So keep that in mind, that peak summer is not the time to necessarily be doing these things. And it's not so much about the heat, it's more about exposing foliage that hasn't been exposed before to sunburn. So you cut 70% off and the remaining 30% gets burned. It's probably not an ideal situation. So somebody asked, would I recommend the wood chip method for an area earmarked for grass? It's a small slope with pine needles and tree roots and trees cut down in zone 5. No, if you use the wood chip method leading up to an area that you're going to have as turf, fescue, bluegrass, whatever it is, you need to let those wood chips break down almost entirely, because planting seed or sod over wood material, even roots and things like that, you'll see that grass will probably be off-colored for some period of time. That wood material requires some nitrogen to break down, and it will off-color your turf just a bit for a little while. It reverses itself later. That it's not that big of a deal, but initially it probably will have your grass off-colored. So if you're willing to put down the wood chips and then wait a very long time for them pretty much to break down 100% virtually into humus, then yeah, it's fine. But if you don't have that kind of time, I'd probably not do the wood chip method, and I'd probably just start with compost already, a compost product. Let's see. Somebody has a Miss Scarlet Alyssium they planted in September. Noticed it was 3 plants in the container. How should they move forward? Should they cut back 2 of them? I probably wouldn't. That Alyssium is tough enough that the 3 of them can compete with one another. I have talked about this. This is not my favorite thing in the world, that more and more nurseries are, trying to have the plants grow faster in the container by putting more rooted cuttings in the container. I don't know that it's ideal, long term for any plant to compete 3 plants that close together. But that Alyssium is pretty tough. This is there's an Alyssium here, and then another Alyssium there, and I have my Miss Scarlet Alyssium over there. They all look like this morning. They're not that happy when it's 22 degrees outside. They pop right back up as soon as it warms up later in the day and the sun hits them. I think they'll be fine. If you went out there and cut 2 of them back, it would just take a long, number one, I don't think you're going to kill them anyway. I think those two are still going to try to come back from the roots underneath them. I would just probably leave it as is. But again, it's not my favorite thing, that's for sure. So this person went to their public garden in zone 6B, 7A, New Jersey, and they saw a purple anise. Is this feasible this far north of the range? So another Alyssium question right after that one. We have a Japanese Alyssium over here. I can't remember the name of it right now. It's got a Japanese name. It's not going to pop in my head right this minute. You're definitely right on the border of where they'll do well, but this Florida Sunshine Alyssium, it will grow in zone 6. You wouldn't want to plant it right now, going into winter, but it is hardy. If you spring planted one that had some decent size on them, they will grow in zone 6. So I would be curious, the one issue you have when you get, up to New Jersey. I'm in Raleigh, New Jersey's, a 10-hour, 9-hour drive or something, potentially where this garden is. You lose a lot of daylight. And so you'll see less leafy evergreens even if we're in the same zone as you go further north. So I'd be curious about it. I don't know how long it had been in the ground. It didn't say how big it was or anything like that. But it's not unusual for Alyssium to be able to grow in zone 6. I don't know what variety it is. Let's see, number 17. Okay, so somebody has a green arrow Alaskan cedar with a leader that turned brown and it's creeping downward. They planted it last spring. Should they cut out the brown branch or just strip off the needles? How do conifers respond to cutting out the leader? It depends on the conifer. You know, like a lot of pines, really, if they lose their leader, can die. You'll occasionally see a pine with 2 leaders where it got damaged at some point and it managed to produce 2 new leaders. But a lot of times, there are a lot of conifers that will die from having their leaders cut out, and a lot of conifers that won't. And so just depends on what it is. But if it's dead up in the top, what choice do you have? I would just go ahead, scratch it, see if it's actually dead. And next late winter, you know, as it's starting to wake up, I just cut it down to the spot where it's dead at and see what it does. And you really don't have any, I mean, there's no other option, right? But sometimes, depending on the conifer, some just grow with a single leader and that's it. And if the leader dies, they're done. And some are will respond to having their leaders pruned out and then produce multiple leaders. So, you know, but again, if the leader's dead, you kind of got no choice here. Just go ahead and cut it off down to the part where you think it's alive in April and see what it does. So somebody got a 3-liter Eternal Flame Red Bud and the soil fell apart when they opened the package. So I guess this was mail order. Should they replace the soil in a pot? Ooh, okay, gotcha. So what they did was they got this thing in the mail, took it apart, took it out, the soil fell off the roots. So it was probably a bare root red bud. This time of year, you'll get you'll get bare root trees. You know, people cut things out of the field just literally with bare roots, and then they'll pot them for the following season. Sometimes they get sent out too early before they actually root into it, and so that's probably what happened here. It's just a bare root red bud that never rooted out into the soil that was sent to them in. They brought it inside, potted it and brought it inside thinking that they were helping it, and it leafed out. So now what to do? The thing needs to go outside and go back to sleep. And so I would not slam it from inside to outside into 20 degrees, but certainly it needs to go back to sleep. Plants can only wake up a few times. I mean, you know, this is, it's not ideal that it woke up already because it's, you know, these things got a limited amount of energy as to how many times it could wake up before it would need to have access to nutrients and access to sunlight and, you know, on its leaves and that kind of thing. So you need to get it back outside, get it to sleep, go through the dormancy that it needs to go through to wake up again in the spring, but don't throw it out in 15 degrees, you know, temperatures. Take it out slowly but surely and get it to sleep through the rest of the winter. And you can just put the pot somewhere up against the house and pile leaves up around it and make sure that it stays cold the rest of the winter. I don't know what zone you're in, but there might be a night or two along the way that you'll bring it inside a garage or something like that, but it needs to go back to sleep. Okay, let's see. In zone 7 is a Golden Falls red bud, okay, in a container. So we're getting all our normal red bud questions here. My Golden Falls red bud, yes, it'd be fine in a container through the winter time. They're tough, and again, those deciduous plants are going to be more likely to be less likely to be damaged as container plants during the winter time. Do I recommend free mulch from the county transfer stations in Pitt County, North Carolina? Is it a good way to jumpstart a compost pile? This will be my controversial answer of the week. I got this material again when I had the old house and I bought it as a 20-some-year-old. You know, I didn't have a lot of, you know, despite the fact that I was self-employed and had my own company and all, when the company's new, you don't have a lot of resources. And so I got material from the Wake County space. And one time I got it after Christmas and it was ground up Christmas trees and it was full of plastic debris from people's decorations that they didn't take off the Christmas trees. And so I spent, you know, a year picking plastic out of my yard, and it gave me a bad taste in my mouth about picking this material up. But I don't want to discourage people from picking it up because it needs to be picked up. It's just the whole thing is a weird operation to me, where I get to sit here at the house and listen to people with their blowers all day long right now, blowing leaves out to the street that they could just mow and put on their beds as mulch. And then a diesel truck is going to come around 3 weeks from now. And by the time it comes around, spoiler alert, half of it will wash into the sewer system. Half of the leaves will. They come around with their diesel trucks. They pick this material up and then they carry it down some other place and then they compost it and then they resell it, you know, for a small fee to people to reuse and drive their vehicles over there to grab it and reuse it and bring it back. And then, you know, it's full of plastic and trash and, you know, all kinds of things. So it's not for me, but I got, you know, a buddy over here that's how he mulches his yard every year, is with the leaf mold from the city. He keeps his own leaves. He doesn't do this operation where he sends them out and brings them back. I also kind of don't trust all the people that spray for, you know, the mosquito spray in here and fertilize their lawns and use whatever chemicals they're using on their lawns and all the other stuff that's in it either. So it's not for me, okay? Unpopular Jim opinion. I don't trust people enough to go and use their organic material on my garden. Just don't. But it is available material and it's inexpensive. And when I, again, was a young homeowner and didn't have, you know, literally any expendable income, it was the best way for me to mulch my yard and initially start it. So there you go. Some opinion's never good on the internet, right? Let's see. Foliage looks good. No color. Colder weather. So somebody's in 9A Alabama and they still have their salvia and Mexican heathers and asters. All the foliage still looks good on them because they haven't had any cold yet. My stuff went to sleep really, really ugly in this garden this week. It's not ideal. And I showed it in a video. That was another video that went up this week, was just back in the garden and showing it off. Since then, all of my annuals, which are no big deal, the annuals were going to die anyway, but they went to sleep really ugly. And a lot of my perennials have gone to sleep really, really ugly. And what I mean by that is they've cracked down at the bottom because they still had water in them. And that's how your stuff's likely going to go to sleep as well. It just is what it is. It's just, we did not have a moderation of temperatures downward that allowed these plants to take everything back down into the roots and store it for the winter before the cold came along and zapped them. So I've got all these things out here this morning that have ice forming at the bottom of the plants where they've cracked and split open. And again, the annuals are no big deal. They were going to die anyway, but my perennials, a lot of my perennial salvias have gone to sleep that way too. It's not ideal. Hoping they're alive. But I'm sure I've lost a couple of them at least from that. Let's see. You could potentially cover a few of those perennials up if you were going to just jump right down to 20 degrees on a couple of those nights. It might moderate it about 5 degrees or 10 degrees with the sheet or a blanket or something, you know, frost protection blanket or something like that. And that may allow them to moderate down to freezing and get to sleep a little better than just going from fresh looking and still flowering to 22 degrees, which is what happened in this garden. Okay, let's see. We are 3 away from wrapping this up this week. 8A Atlanta going away for a week during a cold spell in the low 20s, high 30s. Should they leave the frost protection blanket on for the whole week? So if you have they have spider's web fatsia, emerald snow, purple pixie, radiance abelia, some camellias. Okay, so anything, the spider's web fatsia, you know, if you're definitely pushing the boundaries of it, newly planted loropetalum in the low 20s, that's something I probably want to throw a frost protection blanket on. So the purple pixie and the emerald snow loropetalum and the spider's web fatsia. The abelia is probably okay. It's a zone 6 leafy evergreen. Camellias are much tougher than we think they are overall, so they're probably fine. But yes, you can just leave the frost protection blanket on the whole time you're gone. If you're gone for a week or two, that's no problem at all. That's what we did at the nursery. We would typically, leading up to now, we hopefully have everything kind of packed together at this point and have our covers laid out, ready to put over top of the plants. And right before we would leave for Christmas, we would throw the blankets over everything. the frost protection blankets over everything, and then we would leave them on until about the 3rd week of January. Typically, we would water well before we put the covers on initially, so we knew everything was moist underneath the blankets, and then we pulled them off about the 3rd week of January and water again, if nothing else. If it was still cold, we would put them right back on later, but it's no problem at all putting a white frost protection blanket over plants for a week or 2 or 3 or 4 or 6. I've had left them on for 6 weeks before. So somebody said they see me at Mance. Do you think there's an opportunity to find an autumn moonstruck azalea? There's nothing really for sale in there, but if we have one in the space and it's Friday when you come, maybe we can maybe I can let you have the one that's in the space, if there is one available. I don't know what will be brought to the Southern Living Plant Collection and Encore Azalea space at this moment, but I think you're just going to see more of them out in the world this next year. It just takes a long time to ramp something up over time. It's also a big deal just convincing growers that it's a great plant. So what I've said with that variegated Encore Azalea was that I've grown a lot of variegated azaleas in the past, and typically the variegation is unstable, meaning they're green here and there. The variegation's never consistent through the plant. They don't bloom as well as other azaleas, so they kind of defeat the purpose of having an azalea if they're not blooming as well. So there's just always, they weren't great. And so then you go out into the world and you're convincing growers, hey, we have this Encore Azalea. So we have repeat blooming azalea, blooms great, and the variegation is stable and perfect. It takes a minute to convince them, and then variegated plants are also then going to be slightly slower to finish than a green foliage plant. So you have all of those things against you, trying to convince everybody how great of a plant this actually is. And so I think we'll just see more. We'll see more and more of them on the market as time goes. Let's see. Last question for this week. Somebody just asked the question about cover crops versus mulch in terms of soil building. So obviously cover crops like a cover crop, like something like if you were going to put winter rye over your vegetable garden, that would be a type of cover crop. And then you were, going to let the heat kill it in the spring. That would build some soil. It would also help your soil because the roots on that winter rye would have rooted down deep into the soil and helped basically give channels for your other things to root in later on. So if we're thinking about a cover crop as an annual plant that we're going to use to help build soil, that's very beneficial to soil. If we're thinking cover crops as like ground cover plants, permanent ground cover plants, like a sedum or an ivy, not that I would suggest ivy or vinca or any of those things, but let's say you were going to plant a ground cover versus a mulch. The mulch is definitely going to improve the soil quite a bit more. Those things are going to grow, root into the ground, hopefully help break up some that soil, but they're not going to build topsoil in time in the way that mulch is. Mulch is going to build topsoil quicker. Something, even something like an ivy, would not tell anybody on this earth to plant English ivy anywhere, but the ivy will lose leaves in time, right? It will root into the ground, help break up subsoil, keep the ground covered, hold water in place, hold nutrients in place, and it will lose leaves over time, even though it's evergreen. It will lose leaves over time, and those leaves will compost and build topsoil. So any type of ground cover plant will help build topsoil in time, and will help with soil, but nothing's going to build it faster than just dumping a lot of organic material out there and letting that stuff break down, or just adding compost to start with. It's going to take, decades to build topsoil and build humus layer from a plant covering versus, you could do it. If you dig down now, you'd have a hard time finding the clay down here below my feet, and it was done with by using 8 inches of wood chips really quickly. So I sped up the clock using the organic material, the mulch, versus using living material. living material will work. It just will take much longer, decades longer, in all likelihood, to really change the soil. Okay, I'm very cold. My hands are very cold. It's again 22 degrees out here this morning. Thank you guys so much for following along. Ask gardening questions down below the video, and we'll do this again next week.